And our first speaker, or panelist, is Sana Khatib, who I have the honor and pleasure of knowing and working with at Iman. She is a mother, a wife, a teacher, and a political activist. The world is watching in horror as we witness the atrocities against humanity taking place in Syria. And as a daughter of a Syrian political activist herself, she follows her father's passions and footsteps in telling the world about Syria and how the international community needs to pay attention. She is also an amazing, amazing leader for the Inner City Muslim Action Network, and I have seen her passion and her real kind of verve for life and for the things that are important to her in action, and I welcome her to the podium now.
Good afternoon. I'm actually very intimidated to be speaking after such incredible women, and I'm not nearly as good of a speaker, but I hope that you can learn something from my presentation today. My first question is, if you are familiar with what's happening in Syria, can I just see a raise of hands? Okay. It's been in the news a lot lately, and it's a topic of conversation among many communities, including the Muslim community. And I just wanted to introduce that topic with a short video clip. That was a silent demonstration that I took part in downtown Chicago. So for those of you who are not aware, there's a revolution for freedom in Syria right now. And the government has committed atrocities and is brutally cracking down on the people who are calling for freedom. This revolution has been inspired by the revolutions in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. But unfortunately for the Syrians, it's been going on for over a year and a half. Over 30,000 people have been killed, hundreds of those are children, and some of those children died under torture in prison, their bodies delivered back to their parents mutilated and with signs of torture. Hundreds of thousands of Syrians have been detained or are missing, and the UN estimates that 500,000 Syrians are now documented refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, and I'm blanking, in Jordan. And 3/4 of those people are women and children. And thousands continue to flee Syria every day. Inside the country, there are over 1 million displaced Syrians living in ill-equipped buildings. And the UN estimates that over 1 million Syrians are currently in need of humanitarian aid. The Assad regime continues to respond to calls for freedom with snipers, bombs, and neighborhood massacres, where they go into villages and in some instances kill entire families by slitting their throats. Bashar al-Assad is following in the footsteps of his father, Hafiz al-Assad, who also responded to an uprising in Syria over 30 years ago by brutally killing over 40,000 of his own citizens within weeks in the notorious Hama massacre of 1982. The Hama massacre era and my father's involvement in political uprising at that time brings me to the next segment of my talk, which is why I personally care about what's happening in Syria. I've only been to Syria one time, and that was when I was 20 years old, even though both my parents were born there and raised there, and I have a lot of family still living there. And the reason for that is that my father is a wanted man in Syria. He was arrested in 1979 for his political activism and sentenced to death. By the grace of God, he experienced an incredible twist of fate when he managed to escape prison. One of the guards risked his own life to save 17 men with an elaborate plan that included slipping his co-guards sleeping pills, calling for an emergency ambulance, and stuffing these 17 men inside and driving away through a landmine-infested border into Jordan. As a child, listening to my father tell me this story felt like I was watching a scene out of a Hollywood movie. The most painful part was the fact that the government responded to his escape by killing and imprisoning members of his own family. My parents have since never been to Syria, and these stories were hidden secrets of the family for many years, but the silence has finally been broken, and the fear is no more. Growing up with these heartbreaking stories, I dreamed that Syria would one day be free, but I never imagined that I could live to see that day. With freedom so near, my passion for building a democratic Syria has never been stronger. And that brings me to my next segment, which is what Chicago activists have been doing locally to create awareness in our communities. One thing we did is plan silent demonstrations downtown. You saw an example of that. We've also been at Millennium Park, and we had silent demonstrations in front of the Bean. We've reached out to the media to do radio interviews, and we've written letters to the editor of various publications to dispel some myths, because unfortunately there are a lot of myths about what's happening in Syria. We've planned local events to raise money for Syrian orphans, such as a walk for Syria that we held downtown on the lakeshore, and a talent show, which came at a time where people were beginning to lose hope and morale, and really we needed something to lift their spirits. So that talent show was nice, and we were able to raise thousands of dollars for Syrian orphans. If any of you are interested in helping specifically financially with this crisis, a reliable organization is the Syrian Sunrise Foundation. They get money directly into Syria for humanitarian aid. And their website is ssfusa.org. Another thing I've been doing is just trying to speak to neighbors and friends about what's going on, especially people who may never otherwise know about the Syrian crisis, and just build an interest in them to find out more. And we've planned countless rallies and marches downtown. So in addition to the silent demonstrations, more rallies and protests. I want to show you a short clip of that. So I think something that's very significant to talk about at this particular conference is how I balance activism with motherhood. I'm a mother of a 7 and 5-year-old. And my answer to that is that I get my children involved in my activism. They attended the silent demonstration. You may have noticed my daughter in her red dress, and my son was in that first video I showed you. They attend our rallies, they attend our marches, they chant, and they understand what's going on. I explain to them in simple, as innocent as possible terms what's happening in Syria, and they really get it. And in fact, yesterday, I took my son to the community cafe. Alia talked about Iman, and we love going to their community cafe event. And one presenter went up and started to talk about the challenges of being a Black American. And my son didn't understand. So he asked me at the end, as we were leaving, "Mama, what was he talking about?" And I said to him, "Do you remember Martin Luther King?" And he said, "Yeah, we learned about him in school." And I said, "Do you remember when we went downtown and protested for the freedom of Syrians?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "That's what Martin Luther King did. He went downtown and he protested for his freedom and equality." So he really was able to see that connection because he did it himself, a little revolutionary in the making. And another short story about my daughter. The first time I took her to a protest, I told her we're going to a protest for Syria and we started heading downtown. And when we got there, she looked mortified. So as a mother, I had that instinct like something was wrong. So I asked her, "What's wrong? Why do you have that look on your face?" And she said, "I don't want to die." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And then I realized she thought she was going to Syria. So I told her, "Don't worry, you're not going to die. We're still in Chicago. We're just going to stand up for the rights of the Syrians." And so she felt reassured. My son actually prays for Syria every single night, and he celebrated 2 birthdays during the revolution, in which both times his wish before blowing his candles was for free Syria. My kids also took part in a readathon for Syria, in which they raised $1,500 for Syrian orphans. So as you can see, activism and motherhood are not mutually exclusive. And it's essential that we raise socially conscious children if we want those children to grow up with empathy and compassion. I want to end with one thought, and that is why you all should care about what's happening in Syria. Last September, I organized a dinner for activists who work for the Syrian cause in Washington. And our keynote speaker was Rami Neshashibi. He's the director of Iman. And he said one thing that profoundly resonated with me. He said, "It's normal and natural to feel the oppression of those who come from where we come from. But I also work on the south side of Chicago, and I want to look at that young Black kid who has to walk through dilapidated buildings, foreclosed homes, and failing school systems. I want to look at that 7-year-old Black girl and feel the same as I would feel if it was my daughter. We need to think about the connections between Syria and the south side of Chicago, between the south side of Chicago and Palestine, between Palestine and Burma, etc. In order for us to do that, we're going to have to do the hard work of connecting our stories to one another. And that is the work that is truly revolutionary and that allows for human liberation." I appreciate